Hello, my name is Nerida Campbell and I'm the Acting Head of Curatorial at Sydney Living Museums. Welcome to the 6th of our Discover SLM Talks, and I particularly extend a warm welcome to our members, donors and supporters. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I live and currently work. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Curators at SLM are constantly discovering new stories about the people, places and things we care for at our 12 sites. During this talk series, we will be sharing some of this research with you as we explore a range of subjects from food to furnishing textiles, from celebrity marriages to colonial bungalows. So keep an eye out for future talks about your favourite subject or for the incurably curious. Tune in every Tuesday at 12 to 12:30 for a new topic. There will be time for questions at the end of each talk. Just add them to the Zoom chat. Today's speaker is Dr. Jacqui Newling, who specialises in place-based social history and heritage, connecting the past with the present and bringing meaningful stories to contemporary audiences through various forms of media, from exhibitions to interactive opportunities for visitors in our museums. She has a Le Cordon Bleu master's degree in gastronomy and finds food a fascinating and useful lens into history. Jacqui co-curated the Eat Your History, a shared table exhibition, is the cook in SLM's food heritage blog, The Cook and the Curator, and author of the award-winning Eat Your History, Stories and Recipes from Australian Kitchens, which can be purchased online from SLM's website. Thanks, Jacqui.
Thanks so much, Nerida, and thanks to all who've joined us today. It's wonderful to be part of this Sydney Living Museum series and also to be part of New South Wales History Week. I'm speaking to you from Wongal country and acknowledge Australia's First Nations people as traditional owners of the land in which I call home, and pay respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and future, and any First Nations people with us in the audience today. I have some slides. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to stop my camera just because the bandwidth can be a bit challenging. So today I'm talking about a collection of recipes that were kept by Rose Seidler, who lived on Guringai country in Sydney's north at Wahroonga, on the edge of Guringai Chase. Her home, designed by her son, renowned architect Harry Seidler, and completed in 1950, is one of the 12 heritage places now in the care of Sydney Living Museums. I must also acknowledge my colleague, Avril Vorsay, who's played a significant role in this project and may chime in on the chat to field questions at the end of the presentation. Rose Seidler and her husband, Max, migrated to Australia in 1946. They had left their beloved home in Vienna some years beforehand, after the Nazi occupation of Austria. They settled in Sydney and Harry soon joined them to oversee the building of this very new and quite radical for Sydney at the time, modernist house. Now, I must say up front that I have limited knowledge about the Seidler family and rely on our Rose Seidler House curators and on written biographies for information about the family's history and their life here in Australia. But with my interest in food heritage, I was naturally drawn to the strikingly modern and well-appointed kitchen that Harry designed for his mother. Light, bright and colourful, the kitchen was fitted with state-of-the-art appliances, a large fridge with freezer, an electric stove and dishwasher, and a waste disposal unit in the sink. Now, these all seem quite ordinary fixtures now, but they were enviable luxuries at the time. And it's said that the kitchen costs more to fit out than the rest of the house. Rose was an accomplished cook and gracious host who loved to entertain at home. Harry believed that as a modern housewife, she should enjoy a pleasing yet efficient kitchen that would allow her to cook but not be separated from her family and guests. It was still common at the time for kitchens to be quite separated and often sort of buried at the back of the home. You can see here from a photograph taken by Marcel Seidler the Seidlers' other son, who also moved here to Australia. The kitchen is open to the dining area and conversations could continue through the servery. Rose loved her garden, and with the assistance of a local gardener, she enjoyed the benefits of a large and productive vegetable garden and an informal orchard of citrus trees. Harry described it as a real mini market garden and recalled guests, including photographer Max Dupain, going home with great boxes full of cabbages and whatever. Tomatoes, parsley, radishes, corn, and kohlrabi, a turnip-like vegetable very popular in Northern Europe, have been remembered in oral histories. And there's a colour version of the kitchen and dining area today. Harry visited his parents each weekend before he was married, and Rose would send him home with packages of food for the week ahead. Wiener Schnitzel and apple strudel are said to have been particular favourites. We're also told that when Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus School of Architecture, visited the Seidlers during his trip to Australia in 1954, Rose served Belegte Brotchen, Austrian-style open sandwiches, typically made with a range of toppings. Along with schnitzel and strudel, which may seem unremarkable and even cliched these days, these were Austrian classics and entrenched in Viennese culture. Reproducing them here in Australia provided a tangible way for the Seidlers to maintain and honour their heritage and share it with others. Food was an important part of Viennese identity. In a recent article about Viennese food culture before World War II, the author Suzanne Belovary says that Viennese cuisine was a kind of prism through which the Viennese understood their world. It defined us Viennese in ways that no other art could. I've lived in Australia all my life and can only imagine what it would be like to pack up my home, not knowing when or even if I might return. What do you take with you? Dining was obviously important to the Seidlers. Among the items they brought with them from Vienna was an extensive silver cutlery service, possibly a wedding present, and an elegant Rosenthal tea set. Now, they were a far cry from the modernist aesthetic in their new home, but Harry conceded that cutlery was one thing that Viennese people took great pride in, and he designed purpose-built drawers in the kitchen for the cutlery. He also had a tray mobile made from which his mother could serve tea when entertaining. Our understanding of Rose Seidler's culinary repertoire has expanded with the donation of a collection of her recipes given to Sydney Living Museums by Harry's wife, Penelope Seidler, AM. Some are loose recipes recorded on pieces of card and paper, but the majority are in two relatively small spring-bound folios, one containing savoury recipes and the other sweet. As objects, they're relatively plain and diminutive, but they reveal some very interesting characteristics. The folios have been compiled in a very orderly fashion. The recipes are predominantly typed in German, their headings in red and instructions in black. There's no index, but most are arranged alphabetically according to their German name. Now, you can see here the opening pages of the sweet folio in the centre, and it begins with an apples recipe, Apfel. The sweet volume holds more than 100 recipes, mainly cakes and desserts, for which Viennese cuisine is renowned. The savoury volume contains 56 recipes and is divided into sections by the kind of dish being made. And within each section, the recipes are organised alphabetically. The first section begins with culinary essentials such as aspic and eggs. The next has Austrian-style dumplings, noodles and sandwiches. And then there are sections for main dishes, sauces, and a few preserved preparations at the end. We have no idea of their origin or in what circumstances they were compiled. A cooking class perhaps even from school. But it was quite common for middle-class women in Vienna to attend classes offered at culinary institutes and prestigious hotels in the early 20th century. This may account for why so many of the recipes lack detail, such as cooking times and temperatures, or instructions generally. Now, this is not unusual in manuscript recipes, and we're certainly spoon-fed these days with every minute detail and step provided. But it's quite likely that these were typed from jotted notes. It's also possible that the folios were passed on by a friend or family member, but it's very clear they were not from a Jewish source, as this recipe for bishop's bread suggests. I don't profess to know the extent of the Seidlers' religious observances, but the use of non-kosher ingredients and food combinations in the recipes are a reminder that the Jewish community was a minority group in Vienna, making up about 10% of the city's population, which was predominantly Catholic. But one of the talents of a competent Jewish cook is knowing how to modify recipes to meet the family's accepted practices and protocols by substituting ingredients and by careful menu planning. The sweet folio particularly shows evidence of continued use, even here in Sydney. A number of handwritten recipes in English have been added, and you can see on the slide there's writing on the back of the bishop's bread page. Some of the handwritten recipes have been entered in their rightful place following the alphabetical arrangement of the original typed recipes. In this case, it's a chocolate cake recipe inserted after the recipe starting with B. Now, to me, this suggests an ardent and disciplined respect for order. The macaroons recipe written below in pencil may seem out of place, but when you read it carefully, they're a chocolate version, hence belonging in section C, and delicious, I might add. But clearly, a great sense of logic has been prevails in the assembly of the recipes. Many of the added recipes appear to be in Rose's handwriting, but others are in noticeably different hands. Some of the loose recipes have names attributed to them, and it's clear that several have been sourced here in Sydney. You can see here, if we work clockwise, starting from the left, the marmalade recipe ends with a name and address, C. Heisberger of Kalara. The recipe at the top I find very curious in that the recipe from Mrs. Unger is actually for a fruit bread, but it's entered in front of the recipe Windmas, U coming before V and W. In other words, it's Mrs. Unger's name, not the type of food, that distinguishes the recipe. Continuing on the right, which is a page from the sweet folio, and it's a note mentioning local nurseries in Pymble and Cremorne, and there's an orange cake jotted below. The index card at the bottom of the screen is one of several recipes attributed to Esther Lecker, who we think might be American because of some of the brand names that are mentioned in her ingredients. These examples illustrate the importance of sharing recipes and tastes in forming social relationships, particularly for women, and for Rose adjusting to a new culture. As a social historian, I was attracted to the recipes in English for this reason, but there was another primary motive. I have no knowledge of German, and beyond recognising the odd common term in the ingredients lists or word searching the titles online to know what the recipes were, the typed recipes in the folios were to me impenetrable. A welcome outcome of our museum's restricted opening hours with the coronavirus pandemic was the opportunity for one of our staff, visitor and interpretation officer Avril Vorsey, who's fluent in several languages, including German, to translate the recipes into English as part of a redeployment initiative. Thanks to Avril's talents, we now have a fully translated transcript of all 195 recipes in the collection. Many of them are quite complex and include obscure methods and terms. Avril consulted published texts, one of them dedicated to Viennese cuisine, written in German in the late 1920s. There are some wonderful turns of phrase. Beaten egg whites are referred to as snow, The word for meringue is vindmas, the recipe you saw earlier, a massive air. Made in the Italian style, the meringues are then piped into kisses before baking. Apple dumplings wrapped in pastry are described as apples in their dressing gowns, delightfully descriptive. There are instructions for pastry and dough to take a tour, meaning to knead the dough and, if made with yeast, allowing it to prove. And there are instructions to cut meat and vegetables into noodles or noodle-shaped pieces, which we took to mean strips. And there are some Austrian nuances, such as paradise, a word rarely used today for tomatoes, rather than the standard German tomata. Many of the recipes require advanced culinary skill and must have taken quite some effort to make, especially when we remember that electrical appliances we rely on today were probably not available when the folio was compiled. No doubt the Kenwood chef got a good workout in Rose's kitchen. From a gastronomic perspective, some recipes really stand out and relate to some of what we know about Rose's home life in Sydney. The sandwiches help make sense of the Belex Brotchen served to Walter Gropius and his wife. And you can note here in Averil's translation, no smelly cheeses has been underlined. A very good advice for a gracious host. There are 2 recipes for 3 fruit marmalade, a good way to use fruit from the citrus orchard, and 4 orange cake recipes. The original typed orange cushion at the top left is more of a flan, but the others are definitely cake. The handwritten orange cushion in the recipe below it is, again, entered in its logical place alphabetically. But it's not a translation of the flan above. For all intents and purposes, it's the same as the orange cake recipe written onto the apples in Schlafrock or apples in dressing gowns page, shown here in the middle. Now, you might remember that this is the first page in the sweets folio. So perhaps it was used so often that Rose decided to copy it out for easy access. It makes a fabulous cake. And the only difference in the 2 recipes is that the one in the front adds a tot of whiskey. There's a page of recipes from Greta Anna's School of Continental Cookery, which also deserves a mention. Specialising in sophisticated European cuisine with home entertaining in mind, Greta Anna Teplitsky taught hundreds of Sydney women, possibly some men as well, from a cooking school that she ran from home, a Harry Seidler designed house at 75 Clissold Road, Wahroonga. Rose Seidler House is just across the street at number 71. Although some years younger than Rose, the 2 women were very good friends. In fact, Teplitsky's son, Martin Teplitsky, was a guest chef during our Eat Your History exhibition in 2013 and spoke fondly of growing up next door to the Seidlers and the thrill of riding his bike as a child down the ramp of their house, an activity that would now be very much discouraged. Collectively, this culinary archive of recipes brings extra dimension to our interpretation of the kitchen, dining room and entertaining areas at Rose Seidler House, adding flavour, if you will, to our understanding of the family's home life. But it also provides us with a deeper appreciation of the Seidlers family heritage and offers a tangible link to Rose's life as a wife, mother, homemaker and entertainer, and a woman forging a new life in Australia. So I'll turn my camera back on.
Thank you, Jacqui.
I'll stop the share and here we go.
Excellent. Well, we've got a few questions popping up in the Zoom chat, but first of all, I just wanted to ask you, what's your favourite recipe from Rose's cookbook?
Look, I've experimented with a few, and I think it has to be the eggs Florentine, which is in a gratin sauce, which is so decadent. I don't think I can go back to my common sense cookery book recipe ever again. It's really rich and really, really quite decadent and delicious. And we do have that recipe and a few others up on our website.
Excellent. You're making some of our participants hungry, but I can see in the chat. One of the questions was about, are you going to publish Rose's recipe book?
So there are a lot of recipes, 195, as we said. We're in the process of digitising each page, and they will at some point be available probably through our library and research collection. And of course, Avril's translations make them much more accessible. But in the meantime, if people have a particular interest, they could use our Ask a Curator service if there are particular recipes they'd like to inquire about.
Okay, and we'll put that in the address for that in the chat soon. Another question was, were there any recipes you or Avril couldn't make sense of?
Oh, look, we spent many hours, it seemed, discussing some of the recipes, because as I said in the talk, some of the things were quite obscure. So it was very useful having that original cookery book on Viennese cookery that Avril acquired. And also it was sometimes just a matter of combing through the recipe itself. So the word paradiser, I mentioned, that word isn't commonly used now. But it was only once we read in the recipe that it was mentioned as a sauce. So we thought, oh, paradise sauce. But it was only once we came across one of the recipes that said to peel and de-seed before using. And I thought, no, that has to be, and it was a savoury recipe. That makes sense. That is what we do to a tomato when we're cooking it into a sauce. So but sometimes it was just a bit of detective work.
Excellent. So there's another question about SLM. So we have plans to digitise the recipes, and will we also make the translations available for the public?
Yes, that is our intent. And as I said, we've started to put some of them online. So, and as I said, often the recipes are quite incomplete. So the translations are very faithful to the original recipe, but that doesn't necessarily make them easily cookable from home. So the recipes, for example, the eggs Florentine that I mentioned and gratin sauce, the apples in dressing gowns have been put on the website, showing that they're the original recipe and Avril's translation, but then also a sort of modernised recipe that you can now make from home. So we've sort of had to do a bit of recipe testing and adapt the original to something that's useful for people now. We've also put the chocolate macaroons and the orange cake recipe online as well, and the 3 fruit marmalade is on the Cook and the Curator blog.
Fantastic. And I'll pop those into the chat in a moment for those people who are asking for those links. How long did it take to translate a recipe is another question from Anna.
Look, Avril's probably best to answer this herself. Some of them I think were relatively straightforward and relatively short. Other ones were really quite detailed and took quite a bit of research. So sometimes that was from that old cookbook that she acquired, but also sometimes it was just a matter of putting the recipe name into the internet to see how it's made today, and then trying to make sense of the instructions in the original. So some of them took a good few hours probably to untangle.
And we have another question. Hi, Jacqui. Was the original vegetable garden and orchard conserved as part of the landscape of the house?
Today, they're not as evident. Some of the trees are still in place, but I think that's the house didn't come into our hands till relatively recently. So that's a question for our curators, or if you are visiting Rose Seidler House, I'm sure the guides can explain the original layout of the gardens.
Fantastic. And for those of you who are interested in sourcing some of the recipes that Jacqui's been talking about, Hayley's just popped the links into the chat, which you can copy and use to get to those. We also have a response from Avril, who worked on the translation, about how long it took. She says, some very direct, others required a lot of investigation, such as determining what the ingredients really were. One question I have for you, Jacqui, another question actually, is how do you know how to create a recipe when you don't have the method described with the ingredients? How does that work?
Yes, welcome to the test kitchen. Yes, normally we have to consult other similar recipes. So, to work out sort of timing and measurements. Some recipes will take a spoonful, but they won't tell you whether it's a teaspoonful or a tablespoonful. So sometimes it helps to look at modern versions of similar recipes to see what other cooks use. And sometimes it's just a matter of making it and thinking, oh dear, it obviously needs, more than a quarter of a cup of milk. That gratin sauce is going to need a cup and a half of milk. So instinct and taste also tells you as well. So that's actually one of the joys. It's such a tangible way of bringing some of these, this is an archive, but it's a very tangible one that we can bring to life by experimenting with us ourselves.
Absolutely, lots of fun, lots of cake too, by the sounds of it, at the end of your experimentation. Barbara asked, was there any sign that Rose may have had to substitute ingredients? Maybe she had trouble finding some of them here in Australia.
Yes, that could well have been the case. And, I mentioned that she grew kohlrabi, for example, in her garden. That was probably not a vegetable that you could find commonly in Australian and fruit and veg shops. So I think part of the idea of being able to grow her own produce was to find the ingredients that she herself wanted to maintain. But as I say, I think she was an accomplished cook. So like many immigrants that can't find the produce that they're used to from home, you adapt. You look around for the local ingredients that will suit the bill.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Next week at the same time, we've got another talk with Anna Kosu, who's going to talk about the residence of Susanna Place in the Rocks. You're also welcome to join us on Thursday for the History Reflected talk series. This week, Michael Leck's going to talk about World War II blackout posters from the State Archives collection. Thanks everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again next week.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jacqui.